Maybe this is a good place. Everyone's sitting.
Perfect. Yeah. And me and Jim.
So, okay, I guess everyone's comfortable. That's good. Great. So I'm going to do a little introduction, and then we'll hear from our guest speaker. Then Paul and I will do a bit of a Q&A. Yeah, so paper.
That'd be awesome.
Watch the other camera.
So my name is Floyd Bernescu. My colleague Ken and I from Commonwealth Canada, which is a nonprofit that is promoting concepts of land value tax and better sharing in publicly created wealth. Before that, we for 5 years, we continue to run another nonprofit called UBI Works, which promotes the idea of a basic income in Canada. And in the course of that 5 years, we learned a lot about history and economics, and then it's just impossible to not think about land value and its impact on the economy, on poverty, on these various on falling productivity. And it turns out that a lot of the historians and economists in the basic income movement all know that land value tax is the ideal funding source for a basic income. So that led us to, now how you promote land value tax, even on its own merits, even if it doesn't pay a basic income, it's still a good idea because it'll encourage ways of sharing in publicly created wealth and reducing some of the impact on privately created wealth, which would create more productivity. So yeah, we're doing this out of passion. We think that as we see Canada's heading in a very bad direction, maybe following the examples in Japan, where we're just heading to extremely unprecedented levels of housing unaffordability, and something needs to be done. And land value tax is not in the conversation at all. And I don't know any other way to address perverse incentives that are impacting supply, demand, and allocation of housing today, and also ways to change the way investment flows more towards the real economy and out of unproductive, previously built assets, than to use an LVT to literally decapitalize some of the reasons that so-called investors are buying previously created or newly created real estate in order to make way for families. So, just show of hands, how many in the room would say that they are very familiar with land value tax? Hands up. Okay, how many are here to learn, are somewhat familiar? Okay, well, I mean, I'm still learning every day. And okay, so we at Commonwealth have been trying to produce real numbers to show in the Canadian context what would the mythical full-on, hog-wild, full all-in tax shift to a land value tax, what would it do, and what are the actual numbers we have to work with? Because historically, this idea predates income tax. It came from a time when this was a way to take power away from the feudal lords so that workers and entrepreneurs could actually have their heyday. The lords of the land were like not adding any value and just taking advantage of everybody. And the first economists in capitalism all said, including Adam Smith, said we should just tax land because land is not created or destroyed, and it's the ideal source of tax as opposed to other taxes that harm productivity. But in the context we're in today, of course, we have so many taxes now, and the size of government has exceeded the actual potential generation of land value. So what is the best way to go about such a transition? So we show here that in BC, this is a sneak preview of some upcoming research. We show that if we were to implement a tax that captured 75% of the annual rental value of land, that would raise $47 billion in annual revenues in BC alone. The province does have the ability to do this. You don't need any interaction with the feds. That would be enough to eliminate provincial income tax, municipal property tax, the SVT, provincial corporate taxes, and still leave another $10 billion in revenues that could be used for other things, like, for example, paying for a basic income guarantee, which would guarantee people's housing affordability in some ways. Now, why would this be a good idea for housing accessibility, for pricing? Well, when you tax something, you get less of it. So tax land value goes down. It's really that simple. Since the rental value of land gives it its overall price value, if you tax it, its price will be less, which means mortgages will be less, people will be less debt, you don't have to save up as much to acquire a property, it'll be more accessible for first-time buyers, and this fairly high and drastic reform would actually cause property prices to fall by over $1 trillion, an average fall of $640,000 per property. Now you might be thinking, holy shit, blood in the streets. Now this is not an overnight reform. Like this would be we're proposing a 20-year slow rollout, converting from one form of taxes to another, to slowly shift towards taxing the rental value of land. And a government could do this in stages. It could first announce, okay, we're going to tax 20% of the value of land, not 75%, and then have that stabilize the market, have incentives, demonstrate that the incentives work, that people are not speculating as much, they're not withholding valuable land from development. We are seeing more construction, we are seeing greater productivity. So there's many ways to do it, but what we're showing here is what would be the end result. Another way to think about this paper is, in 20 years, how much more affordable would an economy be? Well, it would be on average like almost 46% more affordable versus an economy that didn't have did not have this tax shift in place. It's another way to think about it. So we look at two different scenarios of how, because nobody would just add a tax. It's not a tax grab, it's a tax shift. So scenario one is the Georgia stream, like from way back, is trying to eliminate all of the other taxes and just have a land tax. And it would do that provincially, including corporate taxes, including property taxes and others. But we show here, what we found is that it might result in a overall net income loss for the bottom half of people, including homeowners, mainly homeowners, not renters. Renters will actually come out way ahead because renters already pay 100% land tax, land rents, they pay it to their landlord. But seniors and low-income people who have inherited properties would come out experiencing a tax loss of their LVT versus their income tax. And then another model is, what if you just raised the money and gave it back to every household as a rebate, like the carbon rebate gives back the carbon tax? Or you can think of it as a form of a basic income, but it's going to households. This actually found out that 90% of households would experience tax relief, which is interesting because in Detroit, the mayor of Detroit is proposing a property shift to land tax, property tax to land tax shift, and is campaigning on it'll provide relief to 97% of households in Detroit, which is quite interesting. Now, you might think, well, you guys are basic income guys, you want this model to be the good one, right? Well, no, we're just letting the data guide us, to be honest. This is not even showing what a real basic income would do. This is just a household rebate. I think the best would be a combination of reduced income taxes to improve productivity for both corporate taxes and personal taxes, with a combination of a basic income guarantee to, frankly, ensure everyone can afford a place to live, including seniors, including low-income people, and to solve an age-old injustice that predates capitalism itself, which is people being pushed off the land as land is privatized and people lost access to the commons, which is ways to self-sustain on their own and be self-sufficient. This could be seen as a just compensation for living in a fully privatized land system where everyone gets a share of the land value in the country, which achieves a dream I've had for a long time, which is how do we share in the proceeds of technology, the proceeds of human progress. We do that by ensuring everyone has a small financial gain from that. And all technological progress, all economic progress always ends up in land value. So it is like the one thing that is indisputable as a way to sort of fund giving everyone a small share so there's no more poverty. So that's kind of, long-term, that's my personal passion about this, is how do we get to a Star Trek future? We don't get there if we're competing over scarce resources like land. We get there if we share in the resources that cannot be shared like land, and instead compete over innovation, compete over products and services, and let capitalism do its thing, but don't compete over scarce resources. And this is how we get there. So that's like the 500-year vision of Commonwealth Canada. Today we're just looking at a tax shift and seeing how that might help political narratives around housing affordability. And so yeah, that's it. If you have any questions, on the back you can see the impacts on 3 different houses in Vancouver. So you might note the first house is a grossly underutilized piece of land. $2.5 million for that little thing, holy cow, and if you had a full 75% LVT on it, the cost to maintain that land, that home, as is, would be $50K. So no one in their right mind would just squat in that home. They would sell it. And so the market incentives would be to do a multi-unit. And in fact, the zoning already allows for 4 units. Why isn't it already 4 units? Because the homeowner doesn't have to do anything. He just sits there and waits for value to go up. That's what LVT will solve. And the SVT is not enough. It just doesn't tackle this problem in the right way. And then the second unit, you can see, this was built only 10 years ago. It's actually not far off in terms of its affordability. Compared to average tax incomes in the neighborhood, they would experience a net income reduction after a full shift. But that's a new house, and it's already a duplex on it. It's likely that the market is calling for maybe just someone of slightly higher income to live in that particular house, or just add one more unit, add a coach house, and you can share that $25K land value payment. Meanwhile, no one's paying provincial income tax or property tax. If you did that, those two families would be ahead. So this is how LVT encourages people to make better use of land and not hoard it away from others. And then the third example is a condo, and here they would experience tax relief. Their actually net income after a tax shift would be higher than before the tax shift. And this is actually what also LVT would do. It's not about pushing everyone into condos, it's about condos where condos are needed. Like, why isn't the downtown footprint of Vancouver twice the size, twice the amount of high rises? If that happened, wouldn't single family residences also be cheaper on the periphery, right? We just don't have the right density where it's needed. And LVT would address that by rewarding this person who's close to downtown on 999 Seymour Street for living in a condo and sharing that land with a few hundred other people. So his LVT is only $10,000, and this is why people are moving to Singapore. And it's why people are moving to Texas, because they can keep their productive gains and just pay for how much property they use. And then that's why everyone wants to move there. Anyway, so that's our latest research. This is not a policy paper, it's just some top line numbers. Really love to discuss your interpretations of it. How would you explain it? What's the narrative here? And this will end up in some sort of policy paper in the next couple months, which we hope to work with you guys to share it and make this a little more of a mainstream idea. So that's it for me. Really excited to hear from Paul Finch. We met at the Vancouver LVT Meetup we organized a couple months ago. Had a great discussion with Paul. Paul's actually doing it. We're doing this research, which is nice, but he's actually doing it in the real world with actual housing units. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I was allowed to say that yet.
No, it's all good. Yeah.
So Paul's a commando at the BC GU union, and actually directed them to do affordable housing. And I just can't wait to hear your story.
Okay.
And so thanks, Paul, for coming.
Oh, thanks. Okay, I'm let's together. Yeah. So thanks, huge thanks to Floyd and Commonwealth Canada. I think I'm really excited about the work you guys are doing, and to just kind of popularize looking at this concept and just looking at how it can be applied. And so looking at this scenarios, you're probably getting sticker shock and being like, oh wow, this is a lot. How do we get to a massive tax shift like this? But I think it's important that you see a use case like this that they produced to understand, there's a journey to get there, or even to partially implement to understand how it can actually work. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how we've done something where we've put something into practice that is incredibly easy to do and practical. I'm going to talk about what has already been put in place in BC that can be used today or tomorrow, and the very clear use cases on this. So maybe what I'll do to start off is we're in the midst of a housing crisis right now. We're in the midst of an affordability crisis, and this crisis has one root, and that root is the cost of land has risen so high that we cannot afford to produce things and be competitive on the global market because the cost of labor is too high because of the cost of living here. We can't keep doctors and nurses here because they can go somewhere else and they can get paid more and live and have a much lower cost of living, so they've got more money in their pocket. So one of the reasons we've been able to even get away with this long in BC is it's so nice to live here. It's paradise. It's beautiful. But the problem is that if you live here, you're paying the sunshine tax, right? You're paying more for housing. It's more to live, and at the end of the day, you're making less income as a result. And this is driving this problem is driving all our other problems right now in terms of affordability. Right? So when you look at the shortage of skilled trades to produce the additional housing and building that we need, it's because those skilled trades are going to work in other jurisdictions where they make more money and it's cheaper for them and their families to buy a home to live. Right? So we don't need to get to the radical use case you see demonstrated before you to fix the problem. All we need to do is implement a proof of concept, a small slice of that, just to show that it works. And that alone is enough to fix the problems we have, to start to fix the problems that we have right now. So I just want to get into that, dig into that a bit. So our current assessment system, is everyone here familiar with the Assessment Authority of BC? Right, so BC Assessment was brought in the 1970s by provincial government, and they brought in an expert New York land economist to set it up. And one of the things he did was make sure that they valued land and buildings separately. And they set up this system with the intent, the implicit and express intent, to bring in a land value tax methodology. That's why our BC Assessment Authority was set up this way. That was consciously integrated into how it was created. From the beginning, that was the people who set it up explicitly stated, this is why we are setting it up this way, because we want the ability to be able to do this. And there's an artifact of this in our existing transit powers. So right now, under existing provincial legislation, you can level a land value capture tax on what's called an area benefiting tax. Okay, and that's in any transit area to pay for a transit improvement that increases the value of that land. You can pay for the entirety of that, but only that transit improvement with an area benefiting tax. That's under the existing BC Transit Act legislation. So that's already on the books. You can already do that, right? That was a conscious artifact of what was intended when the BC Assessment Authority was created and set up the way it was in the 1970s here in BC. So why? The value of land fundamentally comes from a couple things. One, it's all the public infrastructure that we build and we pay for with our tax dollars to make it valuable. Roads, utilities, energy, hospitals, schools, rapid transit. This is all the stuff that gives it value, right? But that value, the things that give it value are paid for by the public. And if you are a private landowner and you're sitting on that, you have benefited from all that public investment without lifting a finger. But there's a second way, because it's not just about the adjacent public development, it's about the intensification of the people that can access that adjacent public development. That's a mouthful, so I'll break it down. We have our concept called zoning, and essentially that's land use, but also the density of land use. So typically when we talk about zoning, we're not talking about moving a property from commercial to industrial to residential. We're talking about residential property where we're saying you can build higher with a higher floor space ratio per the land footprint. What that means in practical terms, when you upzone a piece of land, when you increase the density of that land, what we actually mean is that you can have more people living or working on that land accessing the same adjacent public resources. That's a higher draw on energy, utilities, roads, transits, schools, hospitals. So it means more people are accessing all that stuff that our public tax dollars pay for. That costs money. But it's the public taxpayer that's paying for it. If you purchase that land and you upzone it, and you don't put a shovel in the ground, you don't lift a finger, you don't put a pen to paper, overnight, because of the upzoning alone, the value of that land will increase many times over. And in the case of where the most extreme cases we've seen in Vancouver, you pay for a rapid transit station like a SkyTrain line next to and within a 400-meter radius. The value of that land's going up 6 to 10 times its original value overnight without a single shovel having hit the ground. Why? Because we know that you can, the productive value of that land, what you can rent it out for, the economy of scale that you now have to build on it, the rents you can collect with that economy of scale if you build to its maximum productive value is so high that an investor, a skilled investor, is going to value that land accordingly, right? So this is the natural financialization of our economy. And why? Because when you look at land, and I'll just ask a question here, what determines the price of a house here in Victoria or a condo? Who here has bought a house or a condo recently in the last 5 or 10 years? What determined the amount that you could pay for that price?
The market comparables.
And what the bank would lend you.
Right.
The cost when you're in a constrained housing market like we are here, where there's bidding wars, where there's a competitive market to go after properties, what is determining the headline price, so if you've got 10 potential, 20 potential buyers, is what a creditor will lend a debtor. We don't usually use those words, but I'm going to say, it's what somebody will lend you to purchase that property. And so if financial institutions are willing to lend higher amounts, it simply drives up what we call the speculative price of that thing. It's the price tag, right? But the math to do that, if you who here has filled out a mortgage application? Right? So you go to mortgage calculator. What are they calculating? They're calculating your cash flow. They say, what's your annual income, and then what are all the things against your cash flow? And at the end of the day, they come up with a net cash flow. And what a bank or a financial institution, a lending institution is trying to do is they're trying to figure out how much cash flow do you have to pay off the compounded interest-bearing debt that is secured against where you live. That's the goal. That is essentially what is happening, right? That is the calculation they're using to lend out that money. So a couple problems have emerged here. One is, I would argue that there's been some overlending. And the overlending has driven up the fundamental speculative value, or the price, the sale tag of that real estate. Two, we have a bunch of land that can be developed here that is underdeveloped. I think you spoke really well on this, and it just explains it. When you have land that is sitting underdeveloped, how can somebody afford to purchase a massive piece of land, let's say for $10 or $15 million, and then just sit on it and not develop it for like a decade? How can you afford to do that? The only way you can afford to, what happens in Vancouver is they put a little community garden on it, and then they apply for farm tax status, so they get to pay lower taxes than usual, because what's happening is when we don't tax land appropriately, we allow landowners, absentee landowners, that might sound familiar to students of history, to squat the land and not develop it. And what that means is when you have a bunch of land that's not being developed, the development opportunities are narrowed into a smaller group of land. And what that means is those development opportunities can be monopolized, and it also drives up the cost of construction. And here's why. Because if you were to actually develop all the land, there isn't enough capital available in the market to develop the land available for development. And the reason why is because the cost of development is so high. And the number one cost of development is the price of acquiring land, right? So the cost, essentially, when you go to develop something, when someone goes to develop something, it is incredibly rare that you purchase it straight with cash. Usually you finance that purchase with credit, with debt. And so you need to have a mechanism to be able to pay off the interest-bearing obligation against the debt, right, without increasing the cost of holding that land, right? Well, we've made that easy. We've allowed people, through our failing to regulate land and properly tax land, to allow people to purchase land, to sit on that land, essentially squat it, and not develop it for long periods of time because there's no incentive for them to develop it. They can sit on it, and they may be paying off some compound interest debt obligations, they may be paying some low taxes, but it's not enough to compel them to say, if I don't develop this land or sell it to somebody who will, I'm going to lose money on this investment. So this is the fundamental problem. And I was going to speak about this separately, but one of the things that's actually essential to this process, we need to take the current approvals process at municipal city halls, at city councils, and we need to shave it down. 4 or 5 years to get plans to approval is not working for anyone. So in order if you're going to tax people to incentivize them to develop, you can't have them go through a 4-year process to get a building permit. That doesn't work for anyone, right? If people are following the rules, if they're going to the state planning department saying, hey, I know these are the rules, what I'm saying is within the rules, there should be an approval process that gets them there in 9 to 12 months. It shouldn't be 4 years. But, and that's not a comment in any particular municipality, that's a comment on most municipalities. This is a province-wide problem. And look, I want to be fair to municipalities here. We don't have the provincial resources in place for those municipalities to be able to properly draw on and assess. So if an application comes to a municipality, how do they value that application? How do they value the land, the development process? Every municipality, whether it's Lumbee or it's Victoria, has their own planning department and their own in-house group. And this makes no sense. This should be a centralized function that's farmed out to the BC Assessment or another similar body, and that the municipality is able to engage on either a fee-for-price basis or a shared services model or something like that to be able to accurately value, assess proposals, move through that process in a timely fashion. So there's a clear way to do this. But it's a bit of a digression, but I'm going to get back on track here. So here's the issue. You're living in a house next to a SkyTrain station. In 2008, the Canada line goes in, you're living on the Canby corridor, and over a 10-year period, the value of the land underneath your house goes up by over 1,000%. Right? We've published research proving this, showing the land raises, right? That's incredible. Right? So people often say, well, if you tax at a higher value, you're paying more tax, I say, congratulations, you're an accidental millionaire. Your land value just went up 1,000%. You just won the lottery, right? You sell that land to somebody that's going to develop it at a higher use, that's going to take advantage of the fact you're next to a SkyTrain that has all this access to hospitals, schools, shopping centers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the thing. When we build that, we spend incredible amounts of tax dollars to build those transit hubs, and we're not recovering that tax money, right? This is what we've seen in the past decade is the largest transfer of wealth from the public to the private sector since the province was founded. That's what we've seen over the last 15 years. Right? We published a report showing the aggregate land values across BC from 2008 to 2018. So it's a bit dated now. We should probably update it. I don't know why we haven't. We will. The aggregate value of all land in BC in 2008 was something like just under $500 billion. And it went up it increased by over $1 trillion over a decade. Over $1 trillion. It tripled in a decade. Right? Now, that's a staggering sum of money. But if you think about it, what it is it's a speculative value. Right? If you tried to sell all that land for $1 trillion, there's no way you could raise the capital to do it. So what is that figure? Where does that $1 trillion come from? It is precisely calculated the same way that your mortgage is estimated when you go and fill out a mortgage estimator. And that's this. The amount of cash flow that can be extracted from the person that is either renting the property or who is paying a mortgage, in which case you're renting from a creditor. Either way, you are paying a compound debt interest obligation to a creditor, one directly, one indirectly, but the same way, you're doing the same thing, because of that speculative price tag, that speculative value. So if you can game up that price tag, what you're doing is basically saying you're going to pay a higher amount in rent or in mortgage costs, right? In BC, we're about to see the pain point of that, right? How many of you know people that took out mortgages at like a 1.5% interest rate 4 years ago that are looking at their mortgage renewal coming up because there's the max length of time you can secure a mortgage in Canada is 5 years. It's not like the United States where it's 30 years. So 5-year renewal cycles, and you're looking at that come up. How many knows has a friend that's like, hey, I'm not paying 1.5% on my renewal, I'm paying 6%. I'm paying 7%, right? Quite a few people. I can guarantee you that's most of the people living in these new condos here in Victoria. And when that comes up, they're going to have to make some sacrifices. They're either going to have to try and sell their property at a loss, or they're going to have to pay a much, much higher amount of their disposable income what stats are showing us is they don't have a lot of disposable income to pay. So what's the third option? The third option is if they got a 25-year mortgage and they paid off the first 5 years at a 1.5% interest rate, and their interest rate bumps up to 6%, they're going to go to a 30-year mortgage. And essentially what they're going to be doing is they're going to be paying the compound debt-bearing interest to the creditor, usually a bank, major financial institution, and they're going to say, well, I'm going to float and just pay down the interest, and I'm not going to worry about paying down the principal. But what's happened there is we've moved people from that dream of home ownership, and the dream of home ownership is the dream of not paying massive debt payments. That's what it is. So the dream of owning a condo or a house, that's the dream of not being subject, at some point, not being subject to these massive debt payments. And that's really important for people that want to retire because they know their retirement income is not sufficient to pay the mortgage. And so we've removed that dream, and they've just said, well, I'm going to think short term, and I'm just going to float. I am just going to survive in the hope that interest rates will come down. And I wouldn't bet on that. I wouldn't bet on interest rates coming down quickly or anytime soon, right? I think we've already seen people saying for the last year, interest rates are going to come down. Even if they do inch down, it's not going to be substantive enough, I think, in the near future to reach that low interest rate where essentially people are able to dump money into assets. So that's the situation we're in. We have a lot of people who are going to be very desperate. They're going to be basically people that thought they had a path to financial freedom in 20, 25 years are actually just paying rent to their creditor. We have people who are actually paying rent. They don't have any ownership rights, and their rent's gone up. We commissioned a poll that is, BCG commissioned a poll that's being released tomorrow morning. And that poll basically said a few things. One of the things in that poll is, can you afford, if you had to move from the place you're renting today, could you afford to live in the same neighborhood? And I forget what the stat is, but it's like 75 or 80% said, no, I couldn't. So what we're doing is we're stratifying the ability of people where they can live. We're pushing people geographically out. We're breaking apart communities. We're forcing people into permanent debtor status. And we're stratifying society into creditors and debtors. So there's a way out of this. And I think Commonwealth Canada has done some great work on this. There's an incremental way as a proof of concept. So I'll talk about, so what we've done in Burnaby, and I don't like to talk about it a lot because we haven't actually finished the project, but I'll just say what we did in the land. We purchased the land for $21 million, we upzoned it, and it's now worth more than double that, okay? So when I'm asked, well, what if this project doesn't work? What if it doesn't go forward? I'm like, we haven't lost money on it, right? What our union's lost is my time in working on that project, right? So we're good. We're good on that. But the important thing is, and the project will be successful. But my point is just that shows you the tremendous power of upzoning on land values, right? So here's the incremental case. In 2014, we started advocating for mass upzoning around transit stations to guarantee and to harvest that value to secure affordability, to reinvest in actually the cost of those transit stations, and also to build affordable housing. So the province has done part of that. They said, well, okay, we're going to buy up land around transit stations, great. We're going to increase the zoning around it, great. But the missing part is we're not going to capture the value. And that's the problem. And that's a big hole because there is such an opportunity here. And I want to talk to a really, really simple opportunity. Even if we look at that 400-meter radius around a rapid transit station in Vancouver, and I'm using a very narrow, limited example here, and we put a land value tax or a land value capture implement on, let's say, if you're 5% above the median land raise around that area, and you just put a higher tax rate on anything above that 5% median increase in land value, when you take a snapshot, you can amortize the cost of building that entire transit hub over 20 or 30 years. You can instead you can pay a portion of the cost of that transit hub and put the rest of it into subsidizing low-income units, right? And here's the question: why should anyone purchasing land that's being subsequently upzoned get to pocket overnight a 2 or 3 or 6 or 10 times raise in that land value, and I'm not exaggerating here, we've got the proof, we've got the numbers, why should they be able to pocket that? I actually think they should be able to pocket some of it. Go ahead, pocket, you made a smart decision on a land play, hopefully you didn't have insider information on it, you made a smart decision on it, pocket that, but the public tax dollars that went to create that land value should come back, a portion of that value should come back for affordability in our province right now, and also for basically to pay for the public infrastructure. So this is an incredibly dense and complex topic. Thank you everyone for bearing with me ranting for a while about this or trying to communicate the concept. I think this is a pretty mature group that understand this concept for the most part, but I just wanted to stop there, and thanks for letting me go for a bit. So thanks.
Okay. Yes, so stay up here. So we're going to do a bit of a Q&A. I have a few questions for you, and then the audience can ask questions. Afterward on that, we're going to move to the second phase of the evening, which is the unconference, where you can propose topics, and we can split and discuss whatever the group comes up with. So there's a lot of experts in the room. It's not just the two of us. So what's next for the Burnaby project? And how do you see yourself using the land lift to finance that development?
Yeah, so again, I don't like to talk about this project a lot because it's not done, so I don't like to talk about things that we haven't completed. I like to under-promise, over-deliver. But the plan is, so we've purchased this land, we've upzoned it, we've got our building, basically we've got our final fourth reading at council, we've demolitioned all the structures in the land, so we've done our abatement and remediation of that. And we're just at the state where we're beginning to let out some of those contracts to do the actual, like we've already got the demolition